Well, hello and welcome. Welcome to Say What? Yes, security and privacy can work together. I'm Michelle Drake, Privacy Services Specialist with Synergistic. We have assembled for you both privacy and security subject matter experts in healthcare for today's panel discussion. The panel will discuss why a collaborative working relationship is so critical. But first, allow me a couple minutes just for some key housekeeping items because we have some polling questions and I need to show you how to do that. So first of all, we have a chat tab. This is on the right of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties or any general questions, chat there. Also, you should see the slides in the chat tab. The polls question. This is what I need your help with right now, if you don't mind. If you can go to the polls tab, there should be 4 polling questions for you. If you can go ahead and fill those out now and hit submit after you answer each of those 4 questions. And then we're going to cover those responses later for you in the show. Additionally, they're in the polls tab, but this is later in the show. We want to know how we did. So there's going to be a satisfaction survey for you in the polls tab, and you can access that probably after about the half-hour mark. And we welcome your feedback, so thank you in advance. In the people's tab, you can see who's here, who's in the session with you, all the attendees. And then the Q&A tab. We're going to have some time at the end of the session for any of your questions. So please let me know what your questions are by posting those in the Q&A tab. And then we'll go ahead and go over those towards the end of the discussion. Also, once the session starts, you can see the screen, full screen on the slides. And you can just click on the lower right-hand section of the slides to go full screen if you need to. So I have personally been so looking forward to today's event. I'm now going to hand the session over to Marty Arvin, our Executive Advisor with Synergistic. Marty, the floor is now yours.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I so appreciate you taking the time to listen to this phenomenal panel we have for you. What we're going to go through today is a brief introduction. And if you could go next slide, David. I think we lost your screen share. So what we're going to talk about, as Michelle mentioned, is say what? Yes, security and privacy can actually work together. And so I want to do a brief introduction of our panelists. And so first up, if you'll go to the next slide, we have Fred Bishop, who is the Information Security Officer at UC Health in Cincinnati. He has had 25 years of some diverse experience. And of note, so you know you've got a real expert here, is he scored second highest in the world on his CISM exam. So that's pretty impressive. Next up, we have David Finn. You'll go to the next slide. David is one of my colleagues here at Synergistic. What I find interesting about David is while he is an expert in information security and privacy, he actually has 2 degrees in theater. So you're never quite sure whether he's real or acting. You also see his certifications there, which are quite impressive. And then last but not least, we have Andrew Moller, who's one of our senior managers over our privacy services, and he is a former investigator from the Office for Civil Rights. He served as a chief privacy and research compliance roles for universities and academic medical centers. He is an attorney by training, so when you get an answer from him, like when you get an answer from me, we're going to say, but it depends. And I failed to do a short introduction of myself. I'm Marty Arvin. I'm one of the executive advisors with Synergistic. I've had 31 plus years experience in healthcare, with 22 of those being in compliance. The other years have been as a respiratory therapist or as a staff accountant in compliance. So let's get to our polling questions. We've got our agenda here. We want to get to know you, the audience. And so the polling questions, if we'll go to the next slide. First question we have for you, and this Michelle mentioned, these are in the polls tab, and you should be able to answer all 4 of them in the polls tab. Where does the privacy officer report in your organization? Is it the CEO, the board or a board committee, compliance, the CIO or CISO, to legal, or somewhere else? Our next polling question, if you go to the next slide, please. Where does the information security officer report in your organization? So pretty much the same answers: the CEO, the board or a board committee, compliance, or the CIO, legal, or somewhere else. And our third polling question to help us get to know you better: does it matter whether the Chief Privacy and Chief Information Security Officer report to the same or a different person? What are your thoughts on this? Yes, no, maybe, or you're just not really sure? And then for our fourth and final polling question to get to know you: do you think it's important for the privacy officer and the information security officer to work together? Yes, no, maybe, or you're just not quite sure on that either. So, Michelle, I'm going to turn it back to you for a moment and let you go through the results of the polling questions so that we can find out what our audience, what our organizations are, and what our audience thinks.
Sounds good, Marty. So to start out with question number one, where does the Chief Privacy Officer report in your organization? Our audience has leaned towards compliance. So we have about 38% of the audience reports to compliance, and then in 20% to legal, and 15% to the CEO. And there's a little bit of a balance between the CIO and the board. For question two, did you want me to go ahead and carry on, Marty, with the four questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. For number two, where does your Chief Information Security Officer report in your organization? The balance, or the priority, or excuse me, the number one would be CIO at 40%. We have CEO at 22%, legal at 18%, and then pretty much an equal footing with compliance, the board, and other. Third question, does it matter whether the Chief Privacy Officer and CISO report to the same or a different person? 40% say yes, it does matter. 30% maybe, 20% not sure, and 10% no. And then, do you think it's important for the Chief Privacy Officer and Chief Information Security Officer to work together? 100% said yes. There you go. The audience.
So that's very interesting. If I heard you correctly, it sounds like a significant number of privacy officers report into the compliance function. A significant number of the Chief Information Security Officers report into the CIO. And then everybody thinks it's important for them to work together. And the 40% or so of people said that they felt, yes, it's important that they report to the same person. And so I think that starts us off with some interesting thoughts as we get into our questions. So if we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to go off camera, so don't think you've lost me, but I want you to focus on our panelists as we go through these questions. So for the panelists, is it important for the Chief Privacy Officer and the Chief Information Security Officer to work together? If you think, yes, it is, why? If you don't think it is, why not? So, Fred, I'm going to start with you on this question and then allow David and Andrew to chime in on their thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Marty. Yes, I think it is very important for the CPO and CISO to work together. It's a collaborative relationship that when you have security and you think of information security as being not, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, obviously confidentiality falls right into line with the privacy officer. And so naturally, there are going to be security incidents and events that will create and cause privacy issues, and it's very important for those two individuals to work collaboratively together to minimize and mitigate the effects of any events, and make sure that they have their teams in a position to address events as they occur. And then additionally, just working together for other components of the monitoring process, for example, auditing of access and things like that, where typically your CISOs have a more IT-based experience, and so they're capable of helping and working with systems and data and making the actual privacy monitoring function work a lot more smoothly. I think that's also where you can see a lot of benefit with the CPO and CISO working together.
David, what are your thoughts on that? I'm sorry, I don't know about others, but I can't hear David.
I can't hear him either.
Nor I.
How about now?
We can hear you now.
Oh, that's a good thing. So all my wisdom was lost into my muted microphone, apparently. But I will say it's really more than important. It's absolutely essential. When I started in the early 2000s, before the effective date of even the privacy rule, I had both roles, and it wound up being really a good thing because we started with privacy, which healthcare kind of understood even then. It was about confidentiality, and sharing was really kind of an ethical issue. It wasn't necessarily a legal or compliance issue at that time. So we had a good 2 years of building that consensus and getting people to pay attention. So when security rolled out, and that's the harder part for people to swallow, they already understood the need to keep this information confidential and private. And so the security became an easier sell. And then we saw more splitting across the industry, the more separation of the security function and the privacy function. And in the last few years, it's been interesting to note that they're starting to come together. And I think that's going to become more critical as privacy really begins to drive a different kind of focus on security moving forward. But they have to work together in order for either side to attain and achieve the goals they're looking for.
And Andrew, I have a question kind of tied to that based on something Fred brought up. You know, he talked about the breach assessment and the analysis piece of that. And I'd just like for you to discuss briefly kind of your experience and who actually performed that and what the relationship was between the CISO and the CPO, as well as kind of what you see across our clients as far as the assessments you've done and who's performing that.
I think that's a fantastic question, Marty. And, you know, I guess the answer is a bit twofold. It's what I've seen that's worked really well, and then where maybe I haven't seen it work quite as well. Where I tend to see this process work really well around an incident assessment, a breach assessment, breach response, is when you really have both offices working closely together. And ideally, you know, at the point of an incident or an event, this won't be the first time these two offices have engaged with one another, met each other, talked through mutual issues and questions and concerns. You know, I can speak a bit from some of my prior experience, which is that, you know, again, sometimes it's worked well, sometimes it hasn't worked as well. And when it's worked really well, I know that the security office or the CISO was going to reach out to me, even if the incident or the event only included electronic data, because they understood that there may be a variety of other questions or concerns that I might have around, you know, how we're reporting, when we're going to report, so making sure we're meeting our timelines, and then of course things like follow-up discipline, sanctions, anything else that needs to be done, you know, in the form of corrective action after a breach or incident. You know, those times where I don't see it work quite as well is when you have those units operating within silos. So, you know, you have a security office that says if it's only electronic data, you know, it's our problem to solve. And the privacy office says, well, if we lost a box of paper records, that's only our problem to solve. But really, you know, whether or not it's electronic data, a successful phishing event, or even the loss of a binder of physical PHI or physical data, there may be questions or issues that both of those offices and their leaders have, and you really want to have a collaborative approach to, again, make sure you're meeting all of your regulatory requirements, whether it's state or federal, as well as your internal policies and procedures.
Fred, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, again, kind of looking at the CISO role and the definition of information security, in my mind, it's not just electronic data that you're protecting as the information security officer. It's also the hard copy data, it's the storage of records, it's all of those things I think have to go into the equation when you look at your organization holistically. And having awareness of those other areas where the gotchas are helps you. It helps you understand your organization's behaviors, and behavior is critical to understanding where security incidents can pop up, and you can translate behaviors that suggest a lack of concern about sending documents to the shredder, is potentially a lack of concern about sending emails encrypted when they contain PHI. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned by the two officers working together and understanding the environment holistically.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit on the next question. If you go to the next slide, please. How effectively do you think privacy and security, information security, work together in either your current or former organizations you've worked in? So, David, I'm going to give that to you first.
Well, that's going to go back a few years, but in my case, I started in the audit and compliance function, but had both the privacy and information security officer titles. And what made that interesting was it was before the effective date of either of the HIPAA rules. So there was no burning platform. There was no compelling case. I couldn't argue that the fines and nation states were going to break in, or that Amazon and Google was taking all our data. But one of the things we did was we got focused on what the real issue is, and that's about the data. And so we built a governance group work based around data protection. And because it was the same person in the privacy and security role, it was fairly easy to move forward. Although things get complex and questions get sticky, and sometimes I had to separate whether I was wearing the privacy or the security hat, because there are differences and there are different focuses involved. But I think it is important that they work together and understand the different perspectives, the viewpoints they're coming from, and finding common ground. And at the end of the day, that really is about protecting the data. Obviously, we start with the patient data, but you have other organizational data that may be protected or considered confidential. And in my case, because we had the central governance over it and one person, it became easy. And where privacy and security are more closely aligned, even in the same person, I see that effectiveness and the impacts of that. It's easier to make decisions. It's easier to move projects forward on either the security or the privacy side. And so things happen a little more smoothly than if you have to jump through the additional hoops.
So, Fred, I'd like your thoughts on that, but I'd also like you to talk a bit about the reporting, because in our polling question, about 40% of the CISOs report to the CIO. And I think that's been fairly common in healthcare, but I also am starting to see a trend where the CISOs now reporting more independently and not reporting up through the CIO, either to compliance or directly to the CEO. So kind of the thoughts about how effectively they work together in your current and past organizations, but also what you think the issues are around a reporting structure like that.
Yeah, so obviously, each organization is different. You have to look at how that organization functions and how those different senior leaders function. I do report to our CIO, but I also have a dotted line of reporting to our chief compliance officer. So, I have some autonomy. If, something were to go awry in IS&T, then, I would have a mechanism for reporting that directly to the chief compliance officer. So I think that organization structure is kind of critical to that. Obviously, having the individuals who are supportive in both of those, the compliance role and the IT role, the CIO, both of them being supportive in how the CISO is positioned is also very important. In our organization, and I'm kind of speaking directly about what our organization looks like. I mean, they are both, and I think that that's a critical component as well. Obviously there are potentially points of contention that can develop, and sometimes those are long running. But fortunately, in our organization, I have to say again that we've been very, very lucky to have a lot of very supportive individuals who see this as a mutually collaborative role. And just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, we have a weekly PST meeting, privacy and security team, and we meet every Friday for 2 to 3 hours to review our auditing procedures for our EHR, and review who we find coming up on audit. And there's an IT component to that might I have myself and another individual on the InfoSec team that work with 2 individuals on the privacy team to work collaboratively to analyze that data. And I think having those skill sets commingled makes a huge difference in our effectiveness in being able to analyze the data and then go through with the process that we follow for our organization. So I think that, again, that collaboration, that willingness is the vital underpinning to making sure it's a successful endeavor.
Andrew, I'd like kind of your thoughts on that, but specifically more to the chief privacy officer. And at least in my experience, I've seen the chief privacy officer report independent to leadership. I've seen them report up through compliance, and I've seen them report up through the CIO. So, it's very broad and different reporting structures. So I'd like your thoughts on kind of both your experiences and what you see in our clients that you work with when that privacy officer reports to one of those folks I mentioned.
Sure. And, I have seen a lot of really interesting examples of where the chief privacy officer sits and reports through. And, one especially unique example is I saw at a university where the privacy office reported up through the vice president for research. And the reason for that was because the university felt that the majority of their individual identifiable health information was within the research context, and they had the funding and within the VPR office and wanted that person to sit there. So there are a lot of, there's a variety of ways that an organization can handle this. Now, I don't know that having the privacy officer sit in a sort of a specific research context makes the most sense for, every university, certainly not for a health system or a hospital. I think the bottom line for any compliance person, in my opinion, and I'm including the privacy officer in this, is that they need to have some ability to communicate with senior leadership. So whether they report to the chief compliance officer, whether they report through information security, whether they have their own stand. To be some ability for privacy officer to, again, to communicate with senior leadership around risks to patient data, patient information, as well as helping that organization to think through processes around things like the individual rights that are found within HIPAA that usually fall on the privacy office or potentially health information management to manage. So there are a variety of areas within HIPAA that will fall on the privacy office, and again, I think it's really important that they have that visibility. From my perspective, I have had I have always been fortunate to have really good relationships with the CISO or the CIO, and Fred, I really love that the fact that you're building these groups together, you're meeting regularly. I wasn't able to ever build something quite like that when I was working for universities, academic medical centers, health systems. But what I did do is I had standing frequent meetings with the CISO, often with the CIO, where we would just and usually we would do this at least twice a month. And part of that meeting was just to talk about issues that we both of our offices shared. We might talk about future planning exercises, things we wanted to accomplish, and then we'd always spend a big portion of that meeting talking about incidents, talking about new areas of risk, and how we wanted to, start working to manage those. And it was a bit more informal than I think, Fred, what you're doing at UC Health, but it still was something that we found a good bit of success around, and we were really able to help continue that dialogue and communication.
So, Andrew, something you said triggered another question for me and a thought, and it's really not thinking about the privacy officer and the CISO maybe for the health enterprise, but as someone who's worked at 4 different academic medical centers, you have usually some tension between the health enterprise and the university side of the house. And so I'd be curious to hear thoughts from all of you on, and David, if I recall correctly, you were at an AMC at one point in your career. But thoughts from all of you on sort of whether there was tension there. And again, I'm thinking of UCLA, where the chief information security officer for the health system reported to me as the chief compliance officer. But we also had a CIO and a CISO on the university side. And of course, some of our network lived sort of on the broader university network, even though it was segregated. But sometimes what we wanted to implement, there was challenges from the university side. So I'm kind of curious on, how you worked with maybe if there was a separate counterpart on the university side, how that working relationship was. David, I'll start with you.
Happy to dive in there. And I was at an AMC, and the keyword, and Fred has said it, and Andrew has said it, and I'll go back and say it, is collaboration. So we had a similar structure to what you described, Marty. We had a CISO on the health component, and then the university had their own counterparts. And what we did was we just worked seamlessly. We had regular standing meetings with the privacy and security from both the health side as well as the university side. And we really worked together. We drafted policies together. We did training together, particularly with the medical staff, where they were working across both worlds. And it really is collaboration. Anything can work if everyone wants it to. And we were very fortunate, since it was so early in the whole process, to say, let's not both try to figure this out. Let's figure it out together and move forward from that perspective. We shared an IRB, for example, and the privacy was integral and built into that from both perspectives, the research, the healthcare, and the university side. And I think that's the only way you solve all these problems. It's easy to go into your silo and say, I don't have to worry about that, but you're really not solving the problems and the issues. The answer is to work together and find the common ground and do things together, and not keep getting in each other's way, but move in lockstep together forward.
Yeah, and Fred, I don't know if your exact structure at UC Health, whether you're a separate entity from the university or a part of the university and have some of the same issues that I commented on, but how's that work for you guys?
Yeah, we actually are. We're separate entities. We have strong affiliation with one of our hospitals directly with the University of Cincinnati. In fact, it's called UC Medical Center, and all of the doctors are faculty of the College of Medicine, and so we have those relationships. But our organization, not too many years ago, was actually a much larger organization that incorporated a lot of other hospitals in the Cincinnati area, and so it lived on its own essentially. And so we do have some, we don't have quite the extension into the university as some of the other AMCs do. And we do struggle with that relationship. It is an area that, to David's point, collaboration is vital. I have my counterpart at the university, and we do collaborate and have collaborated in the past. But I think from an overall perspective, it's a little bit harder when the IT departments are completely separate and operate very separately and in a much different mindset. And it is an area that we definitely need to continue to work to improve.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm not sure if you're frozen on your camera, but if you can hear me, I know at the University of Arizona, this was a little bit of the infrastructure you had in place. So comments on that?
Sure. And can you hear me now? Okay. Hopefully I'm not frozen.
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. It was. So University of Arizona, has its own College of Medicine, its own health sciences. It's a hybrid entity with various covered, units within its healthcare component. And then it has an affiliated medical center. And I think when I think back on, some of the things David has shared and Fred has shared, I guess for me in my mind, I'm thinking about, why this conversation is important. And why things like collaborate visibility is really important. Incident or you have a breach, the organization needs to quickly determine, back to what Caleb said earlier this morning, who's in charge and who handles this investigation, who takes the lead, and who's included. And so I think, when I think back again, this dynamic between a university, an academic medical center, a health system, if there is an incident involving PHI that may flow between the two organizations, those organizations as collaborative partners, as affiliated entities, sometimes they need to who's going to lead the investigation, what the investigation will entail, because there's a clock that's ticking, right? And you can't just take as long as you'd like, as much as we'd like to have that much time. You have to work very quickly to resolve an incident and get to the bottom of it and make any reporting that you have to do. And so in my case, it was very similar to what I described, in building relationships with the CIO and the CISO. So it's hard to build good relationships with the compliance team over at my partners, over at our affiliated entities. And really what that meant in some cases was, starting with some informal conversations. So getting coffee, getting lunch, getting to know them, and helping them understand the things that, woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, or the things that kept me up at night. And we would find mutual ground. And somebody, at the health system would say, well, we're really worried about the data that flows into the university for research purposes, for example. And we don't know that we have a lot of confidence that the university would reach out to us if they're. And so we worked together to develop policy and procedures across the organization that were going to help both of these entities respond appropriately, mitigate risk, and continue to build on successes, so that if one of the groups went down, the entire fleet of ships didn't go with it. We were all working together to keep things moving. And
so in thinking about that, one of the things I want to comment on that I found quite interesting, and I don't know how many other folks on the call are from academic medical centers, but I was part of what we call the privacy board at UCLA. And in my role as chief compliance officer for the health system, I participated in that, but it was a campus level activity. And one of the things I found interesting and I hadn't really considered is the privacy view of the faculty members and the view that they bring to the table about things you might want to put in place and what kind of restrictions you might want to add to a system to harden the system and to better protect your data. that tie into what they feel is their right and ability to do their job as a faculty member. And I just point that out, that it was kind of fascinating to me. We had a whole group of people around the table, some people from the law school, some people from our IT professors and folks like that. And just a plethora of different perspectives on how you put something in place and how you think about it. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll go to our final discussion topic question. And again, for all of you, how well does privacy and information security collaborate on strategic planning in their annual work plans or their annual processes? So just sort of the questions around the forward thinking process and how well they work together. And based on what you all have said so far, I would anticipate you're going to say in the organizations you've been at or that you're currently at, they work pretty well together. So I'd like you to also comment if you've had experiences where maybe it wasn't quite as aligned as you would have preferred. So Fred, I'm going to toss this question to you first.
Yeah, we have a pretty good strategic process in place. Whether it's education, in fact, we've been meeting regularly to talk about our annual training. Whether it's the privacy and compliance run their own annual audits. So I think we're collaborating in those areas, and I think a willingness to participate as a CISO, it really helps seal that relationship, and certainly we also look at it from the perspective. And I'm saying IT owns the auditing tool that we use, but it's obviously privacy that really is performing the final audit reviews and going through the breach notifications and things like that. So, having that strategic planning for, are we going to expand the system? Are we going to do additional audits? Are we going to add, additional features or capabilities? Are all things that are important to discuss. And so, by having those regular meetings, and Andrew and David, I meet regularly with our CPO as well, beyond just our team meetings, and it's very effective to do that. And I would highly encourage CISOs to engage their CPOs to really work to find those common grounds where both sides can benefit from improving their control measures that they have in place, from both the privacy and the security side.
Thank you. David, thoughts, comments?
Yeah, and I had it easy because I was both privacy and information security, and so it was easy to plan together, although we still had issues. And so I'm going to kind of step forward into what I've been seeing the last few years here at Synergistic across our customer base, and even internally, where we have to deal with privacy and information security as well. And one of the things that's changing is the tools are a lot more elaborate. We've seen a great movement to the cloud, and as the tools get kind of embedded into some of these things, information technology and even information security, because it's there, forget that they have to work with other groups. So one of the areas I see at a lot of customers, and we've struggled with who gets to set it and how it gets set here, is the sensitivity of the data, or the classification of the data and the data mapping. It's easy to go into your Outlook instance and IT runs that, so they make decisions, and sometimes even in the EHR, which may be owned by the technology may be owned by IT, but the medical record may belong to HIM, and they may have different ideas about that. And so I think we're seeing this shift from information security, which is very broad, and privacy, which is very focused on a specific set of information, into a broader approach to data governance, whether it's research data or EPHI, or just information about the organization. And I think it's going to drive a shift to how we actually do this privacy and information security and even IT planning around data. Because if you don't bring everyone to the table up front, you're going to wind up with some disconnects and missed dots as you begin to roll out or implement these technologies, or even write the policies and procedures around who gets what access to which data, when and from where. And the world's just getting way more complicated in terms of the data. And so I think both privacy and InfoSec are going to have to back up and take a broader perspective on the governance, not just technology. We heard Ite earlier talking about people, process, and technology, but the people are still the key to it, and often the most difficult part. But the planning has to be done together, the annual work plans and the strategy around technology, and even the processes and procedures you're going to be implemented have to be done jointly across not only the privacy and security area, but the business units as well, who have the users of that information and the technology.
So as you guys have been talking, one of the things that I thought about, and I see this as I go out and speak to our clients, is, Fred, you mentioned auditing, and it depends on who I'm talking to, the response I get to what that means. Because as somebody who's worked more in the compliance and privacy side, if you talk about the auditing requirements that are under the security rule, I always tended to focus on the user access monitoring and auditing. And when I talk to the CIO or CISO and ask them questions of, do you do the auditing and monitoring? They'd say, oh, yes, we do that. But as I dug a little deeper, it would oftentimes be auditing and monitoring of application accesses and not really the user looking, who's accessing a patient record, for example. So I'd just be curious on whether that's something you've encountered as well, or had those conversations with the privacy officer, and you find out you're not both talking apples and apples.
For us, I think we've always been in lockstep with what the auditing function was supposed to accomplish. So it hasn't really been an issue between the CPO and myself. IT does a lot of auditing, as you're talking about it. It's not just access to what information, but just to what applications, as you mentioned. So I certainly see a lot of other auditing functions being conducted exclusively by IT. Sometimes those are as a result of internal or external auditors coming in and saying you need to do a 3-month review of user access to your accounting system, right? So I think you see a lot of those other types of audits occurring, but at least between us two, I think we've been in lockstep in terms of the auditing of access.
Thank you. But I think that's also, though, important that you make sure that the terminology you're using between the two is consistent and you mean the same thing by the term you're using, so that you might go down a pathway of a conversation and you each think you understand what's going on, but then you realize at some point that you've been using the terminology in a different context. So before we pause for our Q&A here in just a few minutes, I have one final question. I think we might have lost Andrew, unfortunately. That's a risk you take in having these types of meetings.
Marty, I'm here. If you can hear me, I think I'm just off camera, so my apologies.
Okay. No, that's fine. This may be a little bit of a loaded question, but I want each of you to give me some quick thoughts on, is it better to have the privacy officer and the CISO report to the same person or not? And again, if you just give brief thoughts on that. So I'll start with you, Andrew, and then we'll go to David and then finish up with you, Fred.
I think it's a good question, Marty. And I would, I would say that if there's there's a benefit to having them report to the same person potentially. So reporting through, a chief compliance officer, for example, because of some of the things that Fred and David have been talking about related to the strategic planning and the work plan and budget issues. What I've seen in my experience, and I think this has worked well, is that they do report to different offices because they have different skill sets and expertise, but they're working well together. So I guess my 2 cents is, based on skill set, expertise, background, it probably makes sense to have the CISO and the privacy office sit in different spaces within the organization, but they're working collaboratively, frequently, and interacting nearly constantly together. Just my thoughts.
David?
Just very quickly, I would start out by prefacing that by saying I don't believe the CISO should report to the CIO. So I think there's an inherent conflict there, having served in both roles separately and concurrently. So I think it's less important that the CISO and the CPO report to the exact same person as that it all rolls up at some point at the top of the chain of command. And it really does, because it's all going to rest in the CEO's lap at some point. But in terms of planning and budgeting, it does make life easier, and it makes the whole planning and spend a little more synergistic, excuse the expression, if they report to the same senior executive.
Fred, thoughts?
Yeah, and I've heard the same that's David's mentioning related to the CISO should not report to the CIO, and kind of from my opening statement, I think it rolls back into the type of the organization that you're working in. And as I mentioned, I also have a dotted line to the chief compliance officer, and I meet with her on a regular basis as well. So I think I think I answered maybe on this question. I think it works both ways. It just depends on your organization. I mean, certainly you can have abuses that can occur no matter who you're reporting to. And obviously that's the key component, is having enough checks and balances in place to help limit the scenario where now you're placed in a compromised position.
Yeah, and I agree with what you said, Fred. Being having been a chief compliance officer, there's lots of information out there from the OIG that they have a really strong preference that the chief compliance officer does not report to, like, the CFO or to the legal officer, that they want them to report to either the CEO or, more ideally, actually to the governing body, to the board. And I think we're seeing that it was a little bit, from what I've seen at least, a little bit more of a lag when you talk about the CISO and the CIO. But there's 2 thoughts or comments I have on that. One is, I agree with David of having a preference that they not report to the CIO because of that inherent conflict. But I also agree with you, Fred, that it's really going to depend on the culture of the organization and the nature of the people in the positions. But I think that could be one risk when you have the CISO reporting to the CIO and you've got a great relationship and things are going well, and then the CIO decides to retire or move on to a new opportunity, or they change, and the person you get in there may not be quite the same fit, and that's where I think it becomes a little more of a struggle for the relationship to maybe work as well when they do, when the CIO does report to the CISO. And I've said the same thing about the compliance officer reporting structure. So I do really think it's going to be inherent on the organization to be cognizant of that and make sure the senior leaders are very aware that they want that CISO to have the independence to go to the senior leaders if it's deemed necessary, if they're feeling like they're being thwarted by the CISO.
Yeah, and we're fortunate in that our chief compliance officer does report directly to the CEO and has a reporting function to the board as well. So there's a lot of autonomy there that, should something arise, I would certainly have the ability to report to a different individual and feel comfortable and confident because of that relationship to be able to report what I needed to.
Well, I want to thank you all for your insights up to this point, and I want to now open it up, and I'm going to transition to Michelle to share with us any questions we might have gotten in the Q&A. And as a reminder, you can go to the Q&A tab and type in your questions, and we look forward to hearing those. Michelle?
Thanks so much, Marty. I do have a question from the audience. And David, I know you touched on this earlier, but maybe some additional thoughts from the panel. The question was, what are your thoughts on having the CIO and CPO be the same person?
Oh my goodness, the CIO and the CPO?
Correct.
That would
Perhaps
be
CISO. Could have been a mistake here.
That would the privacy and security officer being the same person, I have less issue with, although then it will depend on where they report, because if they have the CISO who also has a privacy title reporting to the CIO, now you've got a separate set of concerns from my perspective. And I completely agree with Fred. Anything can work if everyone agrees to it. And there's mitigating controls, there's additional structures that you can put in place, and there's always ways to make that thing work. And if everyone wants it to, it's going to be fine. But I think you want to avoid inherent risks if you can. And so the CPO and the CISO being the same person, I would have less concerns about, depending on where they report it, outside of IT.
I'm just going to chime in. I personally, I agree with what you said, David, but I think one of the challenges with that, in my opinion, is the skill set that a privacy officer needs and the skill set that a CIO or CISO needs, I think are vastly different. And finding somebody, I mean, they have to be collaborative and there's some overlap, but finding somebody who has that complete skill package, I think would be very challenging to put both roles in the same person. Now, I have seen that occur, but it's oftentimes where the person has the title, but they have two individuals reporting to them that each have the specific skill set for privacy and for information security.
And I completely agree, Marty. 10 years ago, that might have been more possible, but privacy is getting so complex. There's so many state rules. There's so many federal kind of weird overlays that cross HIPAA now. And so I would have to agree with you. Finding that person would be the bigger challenge.
So I have another question for the team. This has to do with a point we were talking about earlier on conflict of interest. Question is, privacy is often viewed as a compliance function. Do you think there's a conflict of interest for the chief privacy officer reporting to the chief compliance officer?
Fred, you want to take that first for us?
Well, I'm the least on the expert.
All right, I'll let you off the hook, and I'll. Oh, you have a comment though.
Well, I just want to say one thing. I definitely would not want to be the CPO and the CISO. That would be an amazingly tough job. So now where it becomes a struggle is obviously smaller organizations that just don't have the resources. And then you have folks wearing, the part-time hats. And I did that in my previous role with Lindner Center of Hope. It was a small 300 employee organization. And so I didn't wear the privacy role, but I certainly wore the IT director / security role. And even that was very tough. So yeah, definitely would not want to normally combine those positions under most circumstances.
So Andrew, I'll throw the conflict of interest question to you on the privacy officer reporting to the compliance officer.
Sure, and I hope my sound's a bit better. I guess I'd have to learn a bit more about the question. From my perspective, I don't know that I see a privacy officer reporting to a chief compliance officer as being a conflict of interest. I could potentially see there being a conflict if and when, and we know this happens pretty often, the privacy office reports to general counsel, because unlike a relationship between compliance and privacy where they're having to manage ethical rules as well as statutory obligations. You have issues in legal that involve privilege, of course, and there may be areas where if I can foresee that if there are areas, and I think a lot of this has seen this in person, where if a privacy office reports to general counsel, sometimes things like complaints, incident response, things like that may be handled a bit differently than they would had they been handled under a compliance office or a compliance department. And again, a lot of this goes back to issues of privilege. When you think about something like an incident assessment and so forth. So I don't know that I see a conflict of interest of having a privacy officer report to the CCO, but in thinking what Fred and David have said, I think there's a lot of unique organizational aspects to a question like that, and it's probably going to depend on how that organization functions and things like visibility and communication from that privacy officer back up to leadership and committees in the board.
So, Michelle, before I move on to one additional comment I have, do we have any other questions from the audience?
Let me just ask one more. Yes, there's two more, but I think we have time for one, maybe a brief response from the panelist. Are there ways to build common governance even if the organizational structure isn't aligned or perhaps ideal?
Do we have time to answer that question? I ask because I think that's a big question. So I'm concerned. Anybody want to take a stab at that real quick?
I'll take a stab. So where you can make very compelling arguments is in the data. So, if you can get the collaborative effort between the CISO and the CPO, and maybe the CPOs can dangle the carrot of, hey, if you need additional tools, working through privacy may be a mechanism for help building that need, and then arguing that, making a dollar and cents argument, return on investment argument to leadership. So, I think once the CISO and the CPO can form a bond and start to work collaboratively together, and then you start to present data and empirical evidence, and you measure risk and you supply that risk, then I think you can build that. You can build the common governance need, or at least have that need become aware to senior leadership, and then hopefully buy them in. Ultimately, you're going to have to, you're still going to have to convince them. But that would be my short take on it. Is again, use empirical data to help move that process along.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. I think that's really an important point you just made. And before we just go a quick overview of our key takeaways, one comment I wanted to add to something you said, Fred, is you commented on smaller organizations that the individual may be the same person, the CISO and the privacy officer, or the CIO and the CISO, or the privacy officer and the compliance officer. And one thing I think people should always be cognizant of is we're seeing more and more instances where people in those roles are being pursued through enforcement action. And so if you're being asked to take on that role because your organization is small and you have limited resources, then you might consider talking to your leadership about either bringing your skill set up if you don't feel like you have it, or making sure you're very comfortable that things are in place to support you and that you're not taking on liability because you carry the role, but you may not feel comfortable that you actually have the skill set you need for the role. So with that, I'm just going to do a quick review of our key takeaways. Obviously, I think through the course of the discussion, we've all said privacy and security are integral to each other. That any lack of coordination or poor communication between privacy and security can increase cost and risk. And then, of course, collaborating on strategic planning can help minimize duplication of effort and improve utilization of resources, and hopefully help diminish the overall risk. So with that, I would like to thank our esteemed panel. Everyone, please go to the polls tab and finish the poll for the evaluation. We really appreciate your time and attention, and we hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you.